There are some faces that seem designed for the big screen. Jorge Rivero had one of them, with piercing blue eyes, a chiseled jawline, and a body sculpted like a Greek statue. He seemed destined to become not just a Mexican heartthrob, but an international icon. In the 1960s and 70s, women would fill entire theaters just to catch a glimpse of him. And critics often whispered that he was the Latin Clark Gable or the Mexican Rock Hudson. But behind the glamorous posters and the carefully posed publicity stills, Jorge Rivero's story hides shadows of fleeting fame, of being typecast, and of the cruel silence that fame eventually leaves behind. Born in Mexico City in 1938, Jorge Rivero was never supposed to be a movie star. In fact, his path seemed to lead somewhere completely different. He studied chemical engineering at university, a serious and respected career choice that promised stability. But destiny intervened when his extraordinary physique and undeniable charisma caught the attention of film directors. One day, he was in the classroom, solving equations and preparing for a future in science. The next, he was in front of a camera, being sculpted into Mexico's next cinematic idol. The timing was perfect. Mexican cinema was undergoing a transformation. The golden age of the 1940s had already faded, and the industry was looking for new stars, fresh faces who could embody a modern masculinity that was both powerful and sensual. Rivero was the answer to that silent call. His breakthrough came in 1965 with the film El Mexicano, where he played a fearless, virile figure who could command attention with just his presence. Almost overnight, he was catapulted to fame. But fame in Mexico was not enough. The dream was Hollywood, the glittering empire across the border that promised immortality. And Jorge Rivero had everything Hollywood loved: a foreign allure, a body that rivaled American action stars, and a charm that translated in any language. By the late 1960s, he was already appearing in international co-productions, rubbing shoulders with names that Mexican actors of his time could only dream of working with. Yet from the very beginning, there was a contradiction in his story. He was admired for his beauty, for the perfection of his physique, but often dismissed for the same reasons. Directors wanted him shirtless on screen, a decorative hero, a masculine fantasy, but rarely did they trust him with complex roles that could show depth, fragility, or true acting skill. His career was built on a paradox. He was everywhere, and yet he was not taken seriously. This duality would follow him throughout his career. In the 1970s, he starred in films alongside John Huston, Charlton Heston, and even appeared in European productions. He should have been a global name. And yet, somehow, Jorge Rivero never achieved the immortality of contemporaries like Anthony Quinn or Ricardo Montalban. Instead, his career gradually drifted into genre films, B-movies, and eventually silence. What happened? How did a man who had the looks, the charm, the opportunities, embracing films that showcased his body but not his talent? Or was it simply fate, that cruel mistress that toys with stardom, lifting some to eternal glory and abandoning others on the roadside of forgotten fame? Today, when his name is mentioned, it often sparks memories of posters, action films, and fantasies of a bygone era. But Jorge Rivero's story is not just about the rise and fall of a handsome man. It is about how the film industry itself chews up and spits out its idols, about how beauty can be both a blessing and a curse, and about how memory, both collective and personal, decides who will be remembered and who will be forgotten. As we peel back the layers of his life, we will discover a man who tried to balance the expectations of an entire industry with his own private struggles. A man who lived in the spotlight, yet fought against the shadows it cast. This is not just the story of Jorge Rivero, the movie star. This is the story of Jorge Rivero, the man, the legend Mexico once adored, and the enigma Hollywood never fully embraced. Every great Hollywood tale begins with an origin story, and Jorge Rivero's was as unlikely as it was cinematic. Born Jorge Rivero Garcia in Mexico City on June 15, 1938, He grew up in a middle-class household where discipline and education were highly valued. Unlike the tortured childhoods of many Hollywood stars, Rivero's early years were stable, almost ordinary. There were no broken homes, no dramatic tragedies to mold him, just a boy who loved sports, who excelled in academics, and who carried, even as a teenager, the kind of striking physical beauty that made people turn their heads in the street. But Rivero's first passion wasn't acting. It was science. At a time when most young men in Mexico dreamed of playing soccer or becoming musicians, Jorge was deeply fascinated by chemistry. He enrolled at the prestigious Instituto Politécnico Nacional, one of Mexico's top universities, and pursued a degree in chemical engineering. His friends remember him as studious, ambitious, and surprisingly modest, despite the attention his looks attracted. In another life, he might have ended up in a laboratory, wearing a white coat, conducting experiments far away from the spotlight. But fate had other plans. The same physique that made him stand out in sports also drew the attention of photographers. In his university years, Rivero was already being asked to pose for fitness magazines, modeling swimsuits, and doing small publicity gigs. His athletic build, broad shoulders, narrow waist, and a body carved from years of discipline, looked like it had been designed for cinema. The turning point came in the early 1960s when a film director spotted him and invited him to audition. Rivero, who had no acting training, accepted out of curiosity. He had nothing to lose. The camera loved him instantly. Even without formal training, his natural charisma translated on screen. His first roles were small, often uncredited, but audiences noticed him. He wasn't just another handsome face. He had presence, a quality that couldn't be taught. By 1965, Rivero landed his breakout role in El Mexicano. It was here that the legend began. He embodied the archetype of the fearless, virile Mexican hero, a man of action who could fight, love, and seduce all in one scene. Mexican cinema was hungry for such figures. The golden age had given the country stars like Pedro Infante and Jorge Negrete, men who combined masculinity with charisma. Rivero remained surprisingly grounded. Friends recall that he often returned to campus, even after his acting career had begun, to visit his professors. He never abandoned his love for science, and he took pride in the fact that he had a serious degree, something that set him apart from other actors. This duality, man of intellect, man of beauty, became part of his mystique. But as his career accelerated, Rivero began to face the first signs of the curse that would haunt him. The Mexican press hailed him as the body, an idol of masculine perfection, but also began to question his talent. Was he just a model who got lucky? Was he truly an actor, or simply a decoration for the camera? These questions didn't just sting. They foreshadowed the struggles he would encounter when he set his sights on Hollywood. The early 1970s marked the expansion of his career. It was during this time that he acted alongside major international stars, sometimes in English-language roles. For a boy who once dreamed of being a chemist, this was surreal. He was flying across continents, walking red carpets, being photographed with legends of world cinema. Yet there was also a hidden cost. Rivero was slowly being typecast. In Mexico, he was the eternal macho hero. In Europe, the exotic Latin heartthrob. And in Hollywood, the sidekick or secondary figure. Rarely was he given the chance to explore more complex roles, to break free from the prison of his own beauty. Still, in those early years, none of this mattered. The world was at his feet. Jorge Rivero had transformed from a science student into a cinematic icon, a man who carried both the pride of Mexican cinema and the promise of international stardom. He was proof that sometimes destiny doesn't follow the path we choose. It creates a new one when we least expect it. And yet, as the lights shone brighter, shadows began to form. Fame is a fickle companion, and for Jorge Rivero, the journey that had started with such promise would soon reveal its darker side. That be why the late 1960s. Jorge Rivero was more than just a Mexican movie star. He had become a symbol of virility and exotic allure. the kind of actor who could sell out theaters with just his name on the poster. But Rivero was ambitious. Mexico loved him, but Hollywood was the dream. And in an era when very few Latin American actors managed to cross over, Rivero seemed like the one who could finally break the mold. His first international breakthrough came when he was cast in John Huston's The Bridge in the Jungle, 1970, an adaptation of B. Traven's novel. The film starred none other than John Huston himself and was shot in the rugged landscapes of Mexico. For Rivero, this was a golden ticket, and his presence stood out even next to a legend like Heston. Audiences in the U.S. began to take notice. And industry insiders speculated that Rivero might be the next international sex symbol, an actor who could compete with the likes of Sean Connery and Alain Delon. Europe also opened its doors. The Italian film industry, riding the wave of spaghetti westerns and sword and sandal epics, welcomed Rivero with open arms. His towering physique and dark good looks made him a perfect fit for gladiators, cowboys, and adventurers. In Spain, he was cast in romantic dramas, his foreign charm making him a box office draw. International career that few Latin American actors of his generation ever achieved. But even in the midst of this rise, the same old curse followed him: typecasting. In Hollywood, he was often limited to the Mexican, the Indian, or the mysterious Latin lover. Rarely did scripts allow him the complexity that American actors enjoyed. While Charlton Heston or Paul Newman could play flawed, nuanced heroes, Rivero was usually cast as the physical rival, the exotic warrior, or the dangerous seducer. It was a glamorous prison, one that gave him fame but denied him artistic depth. Still, Rivero worked relentlessly. He spoke English fluently, he trained tirelessly. Anthony Quinn had broken barriers decades earlier, but he was an exception. Ricardo Montalban found fame in television with Fantasy Island, but even he struggled for serious film roles. Jorge Rivero was caught in the same paradox: admired, even adored, but never fully accepted. Back in Mexico, however, Rivero remained a star. He continued to headline local productions, where he was treated not as an exotic stereotype, but as the central hero. Fans adored him. Magazines covered his every move, and he was considered one of the most bankable actors of his generation. For a time, he balanced both worlds, Hollywood and Mexico, international glamour and national pride. Yet, as the 1970s turned into the 1980s, cracks began to appear. The Hollywood roles became fewer, and the Mexican film industry itself entered a period of decline. Rivero was still admired, still handsome, still physically imposing, but the opportunities to shine on the big stage were slipping away. Younger actors were emerging, and the industry was shifting toward new styles and new audiences. And so, Jorge Rivero found himself at crossroads. He had conquered Mexico, he had tasted Hollywood, he had worked alongside legends, but he hadn't achieved the immortality he once seemed destined for. The perfect face, the perfect body, the international opportunities, and yet something was missing. What happens when an actor has everything the world claims to value, and still the world doesn't fully embrace him? What happens when the international dream collides with the harsh reality of typecasting, industry politics, and the fleeting nature of beauty? For Jorge Rivero, these questions were not abstract. They were his life. And as the 1980s dawned, his story began to shift from triumph to survival. That'd be why the late 1970s. Jorge Rivero had achieved what many actors only dream of. He was famous across 2 continents, adored by audiences in Mexico, respected enough to share the screen with Hollywood legends, and still young enough to believe the best was yet to come. On magazine covers, he was celebrated as a symbol of virility, the embodiment of a Latin lover who could rival any Hollywood star. Women swooned, producers called, and journalists described him as the face that could not be ignored. But Hollywood's attention span is notoriously short. For all his charisma, was no longer the fresh new face. Younger actors were emerging, television was pulling audiences away from theaters, and Hollywood had moved on to a new generation of leading men. Still, Rivero refused to surrender. He reinvented himself in European co-productions, low-budget thrillers, and genre films. He starred in sword and sorcery adventures, in campy westerns, even in exploitation-style action flicks. His discipline remained unmatched. He trained daily, maintained his sculpted body, and carried himself with the dignity of a star even when the scripts were beneath his talent. He was determined not to vanish. Yet, the slow fade had already begun. In Hollywood, he became a curiosity, someone remembered from a handful of films with Charlton Heston or John Huston, but not someone studios called first. In Mexico, he was still beloved. Jorge Rivero had been celebrated for his looks his entire life. But in an industry obsessed with youth, the very thing that had made him irresistible became a liability as he aged. Audiences who once marveled at his body now compared him to the younger stars who were rising. The mirror, once his ally, became a silent reminder of time's relentless march. Off-screen, Rivero lived a quieter life than many of his peers. Unlike other stars who courted scandal, his private life remained relatively discreet. He was known as a man of discipline. What does an actor do when the spotlight dims? Does he chase it, no matter how humiliating the roles? Does he retreat, content with the memories of applause? Or does he live in the in-between? A man who was once adored by millions, now navigating the silence of obscurity? For Jorge Rivero, the answer would come in the next chapter of his life, a chapter defined not by fame, but by survival, resilience, and the dignity of accepting what time takes away. Every actor who tastes fame eventually discovers its hidden cost. For Jorge Rivero, the price was cruelly ironic. The very beauty that made him famous became the weapon that limited him, and later, the reason Hollywood forgot him. By the 1980s, Rivero was no longer the fresh discovery. His sculpted physique and piercing eyes still commanded attention, but audiences had shifted their gaze to younger idols. Hollywood, always hungry for the new, no longer had space for him. The same studios that once whispered about him as the next great Latin star now relegated him to supporting roles, or worse, didn't call at all. The Mexican press began to speculate. Yet here he was, watching his career slip away, not because of scandal or personal failure, but simply because time had moved on. Rivero faced another cruel paradox. He had lived a life with surprisingly few public scandals. Unlike other stars of his generation, there were no wild affairs splashed across tabloids, no drug binges, no violent outbursts. In fact, his private life was almost too quiet. He lived with dignity, maintained his fitness, kept his circle small. But in the brutal world of celebrity, where scandal fuels longevity, his silence became invisibility. Hollywood thrives on drama, and Rivero gave them none. Still, there were whispers of frustrations on set, of tensions with directors who saw him as a model rather than an actor. Colleagues recalled moments where he would quietly express his disappointment at the lack of serious roles. He wanted to be challenged, to show depth, but the industry refused to let him. Instead, he was trapped in films that relied on his body, his looks, and his exotic allure. It was a prison with golden walls. Financially, Rivero weathered the storm better than many of his contemporaries. He had invested wisely, lived modestly compared to Hollywood standards, and avoided the traps of reckless spending. But money could not shield him from the loneliness of fading fame. He had once been adored by millions, his face plastered across posters and magazines. Now he walked streets where only a few recognized him, often older fans who spoke his name with nostalgia. The applause had turned into echoes. The 1990s saw him appear occasionally in Mexican cinema, often in small productions that lacked the prestige of his earlier work. He was still professional, still handsome, still disciplined, but his era had passed. Younger stars, shaped for the television boom, captured the spotlight. Rivero belonged to a different time, and the world was moving on without him. For an actor whose identity was built on being seen, this invisibility was perhaps the greatest wound. Fame, once intoxicating, became a ghost that haunted him. Every poster, every film reel, Every faded photograph was a reminder of what had been and what would never return. And yet, through it all, Rivero never collapsed. Hollywood remembers those who burn brightly and destructively. It rarely remembers those who fade gracefully. For Jorge Rivero, the tragedy was not ruin, it was obscurity. Behind the smile of the handsome star lay a shadow, the knowledge that he had been so close to immortality, only to watch it slip away. That he had been admired for his perfection, but denied the chance to prove his humanity. That he had lived the dream, only to discover it was never truly his. As the 21st century dawned, Jorge Rivero was no longer a name on posters or in magazines. He had become a memory, a handsome face in old films, a legend whispered about by those who remembered Mexico's golden idols. But the man himself remained, living quietly, carrying the weight of a career that had promised everything and delivered only half. And so, the question remains, was Jorge Rivero a victim of his beauty or of an industry that never knew what to do with him? Perhaps both. Perhaps his story is not just about one man, but about every actor who dares to believe that fame will last forever. When the lights dim and the cameras stop rolling, many actors struggle to find meaning in the silence. For Jorge Rivero, that silence became his reality in the later years of his life. The man who had once been projected larger than life on cinema screens across Mexico, Europe, and even Hollywood, gradually disappeared into the background of an industry that had once adored him. By the 2000s, Rivero was rarely seen on screen. The Mexican film industry had transformed, shaped by television stars and a new generation of filmmakers who were pushing boundaries in entirely different directions. Rivero's era of gladiators, cowboys, and swashbuckling heroes had become almost camp, a relic of a cinematic style that no longer existed. Younger audiences knew little of him, except perhaps as the handsome man their parents remembered. And yet, Rivero did not crumble. Unlike many of his contemporaries who clung desperately to the spotlight, he chose to step back. His later life was marked by dignity, privacy, and an unusual grace. He avoided scandal, rarely gave interviews, and when he did appear, he spoke with calm pride about his career. "I lived the dream," he once said in a rare conversation. "Not everyone gets to see their face on a movie poster. Not everyone gets to act with legends. I have no regrets." But beneath the words lay a complexity. Friends and colleagues have hinted that Rivero felt the sting of being forgotten. He had been close to breaking through Hollywood's barriers, close to becoming a true international icon. To come so near and yet fall short, it was a wound that never fully healed. Still, he refused bitterness. He had seen too many stars turn their disappointments into self-destruction, and he refused to join them. Instead, Rivero built a quieter life. He invested in property, enjoyed the stability that many actors never achieve, and focused on his health. Even into his later years, he maintained his discipline, keeping the physique that had made him famous decades earlier. To see Jorge Rivero in his 60s or 70s was to see a man who still carried himself like a star, even if the world no longer looked. Occasionally, he was honored at retrospectives of Mexican cinema, where his films from the 1960s and 70s were celebrated as part of the nation's cultural memory. Audiences who attended these events often marveled at his presence, remarking that he still looked remarkably similar to the star they remembered. For a brief moment, the applause returned. The cameras flashed, and Rivero once again stood in the light. But the moments were fleeting, and when the ceremonies ended, he returned to his quiet existence. The tragedy of Jorge Rivero's later years is not scandal or ruin, but invisibility. He was not destroyed by addiction, bankruptcy, or shame. Instead, he was swallowed by silence. For an actor, perhaps this is the cruelest fate, not to be hated, not to be disgraced, but simply to be forgotten. And yet, even in this silence, Rivero's legacy endures. He represents a generation of Mexican actors who dared to cross borders, who carried their country's image into Hollywood and Europe at a time when opportunities were scarce. He was proof that Latin actors could stand beside Charlton Heston, John Huston, and other Hollywood giants. He embodied masculinity in a way that defined an era of cinema. For Mexican audiences, he remains a symbol of national pride, a reminder of a time when their cinema could produce stars who dazzled both at home and abroad. For film historians, his career is a study in the paradox of fame, how beauty can be both a gift and a curse, how opportunities can be abundant and yet empty, how international stardom can slip away despite having all the right ingredients. As he aged, Rivero became something even rarer than a star. He became a survivor. He avoided the scandals. In a world obsessed with burning bright, he showed the quiet strength of simply enduring. Every actor leaves behind two stories, the one they lived and the one the world remembers. For Jorge Rivero, these stories do not align. He lived as a star, adored in Mexico, admired abroad, a man who once stood beside Hollywood giants. But the world remembers him only faintly, his name often absent from the lists of international legends. And yet perhaps that is where his true legacy lies, not in what was achieved, but in what was almost achieved. Rivero's career is a reminder of the fragility of stardom. He had everything: looks, charm, discipline, opportunities across continents. Few Mexican actors of his generation traveled as far as he did, appeared in as many international productions, or shared the screen with as many legends. But Hollywood, for all its glamour, never fully embraced him. He remained on the margins, admired but never immortalized. His story reflects the barriers that Latin actors faced and still face, in an industry that claims to love diversity but rarely gives it true power. In Mexico, his image remains iconic. He was one of the last great galanes, the archetypal leading man of a national cinema that has since vanished. For older audiences, he symbolizes a time when Mexican films filled theaters and stars were worshipped like gods. In that sense, Rivero's name will always carry nostalgia, a bittersweet memory of a golden age that slipped away. But the deeper legacy of Jorge Rivero may lie not in cinema, but in endurance. Unlike many stars who chased fame until it destroyed them, he carried his decline with dignity. He never begged for roles, never manufactured scandal, never allowed bitterness to define him. Instead, he accepted obscurity as calmly as he once accepted applause. That choice, rare in the world of fame, gives his story a quiet nobility. And yet, questions linger. Could he have been more? Had Hollywood taken him seriously? Could he have broken through the stereotypes if he had fought harder or chosen different roles? Was his tragedy one of personal decisions, or of an industry that never wanted to let him rise? These questions will never have answers, and maybe that is why his story feels so haunting. He was so close to greatness, but his legacy rests in the shadows. Film historians may look back and see Jorge Rivero as a case study in beauty's curse. His physique opened doors, but also closed them. Producers wanted the body, not the soul. They wanted the shirtless hero, not the complex man. His gift became his prison, and when time inevitably softened his looks, the industry had nothing left to offer him. And yet, there's another way to see his story, as a triumph. He came from a modest family, studied chemical engineering, and could have lived a quiet life in a laboratory. Instead, he lived as a star, traveled the world, acted with Hollywood legends, and left his mark on multiple continents. For decades, he was adored, desired, admired. Not everyone achieves immortality, but to live such a life, even for a time, is its own form of victory. In the end, Jorge Rivero's legacy is not carved in the halls of Hollywood, but in the memories of those who watched him, in the women who once pinned his posters to their walls, in the audiences who filled theaters in Mexico to see their idol, in the whispers of film lovers who recall the handsome man who stood beside Charlton Heston, who carried Mexican masculinity into Hollywood's frame, even if only briefly. As the lights dim on his story, Jorge Rivero remains an enigma, a man who had everything, yet never reached the heights it promised, a man who faded gracefully, but at the cost of being forgotten. A man whose beauty gave him the world, and whose silence took it away. Perhaps that is his final role, not as a legend of cinema, but as a cautionary tale about fame itself. The applause always ends. The posters always fade. The spotlight always moves on. What remains is the man. And Jorge Rivero, in the end, remained dignified, disciplined, and unbroken. That, too, is a kind of immortality.